I trusted her with my secrets, my fears, my future. She held my hand when I cried and smiled when I succeeded. What I didn't know was that every time my life fell apart, she was standing just behind me, quietly pulling the strings. I didn't lose my job, my relationships, or my peace by accident. I lost them because my best friend was secretly ruining my life. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I used to believe that betrayal came with warning signs, raised voices, or sudden distance, but I learned the hard way that the most dangerous betrayals come wrapped in familiarity, laughter, and shared memories. Her name was Lena, and for nearly 15 years, she wasn't just my best friend, she was my chosen family. We met in our early 20s, two women trying to survive in a city that didn't care whether we made it or not. We shared cramped apartments, instant noodles, dreams scribbled on scraps of paper, and long talks that lasted until the sun came up. When people asked me who knew me best, I didn't hesitate. I said her name. I said it with pride. Back then, my life felt like it was finally taking shape. I had landed a steady job in marketing after years of short contracts, and for the first time, I felt seen at work. My manager trusted me, my ideas were getting approved, and I came home every evening exhausted but hopeful. Lena was always the first person I told. She would sit across from me on my couch, legs tucked under her, nodding enthusiastically as I talked about campaigns and deadlines. She told me she was proud of me. She told me I deserved it. I believed her. When I started dating Amir, she was there too. She helped me pick out outfits, teased me about my nervous laugh, and insisted on hearing every detail after our dates. She warned me gently, the way good friends do, to be careful, not to rush, not to give too much too soon. I thought her advice came from love. I thought her concern meant protection. Looking back now, I realize how carefully she listened, how quietly she filed everything away. The first crack appeared so subtly that I didn't recognize it as a crack at all. I was passed over for a promotion I was almost certain I would get. My manager called me into his office, his expression uncomfortable, and told me that while my work was strong, there were concerns about my professionalism and team dynamics. I remember nodding, pretending to understand, while my mind raced. No one had ever mentioned any concerns before. When I told Lena that night, she frowned sympathetically and said workplaces could be political. She told me not to take it personally. I didn't. I trusted her explanation more than my own confusion. But then small things began to stack up, like pebbles in my shoe. Colleagues grew distant. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. One coworker asked me, half joking, if I was always that competitive. I laughed it off, but the word lodged itself in my chest. Competitive wasn't how I saw myself. At home, Amir started pulling away too. He canceled plans more often, seemed distracted when we were together, and once, during an argument, accused me of being manipulative. The word hit me like a slap. Manipulative. It sounded nothing like me, and yet it echoed something I'd heard at work. Each time something went wrong, Lena was there to comfort me. She made tea, rubbed my back, told me people misunderstood strong women. She said success made others jealous. Her voice was soothing, convincing, almost rehearsed, and I clung to her words because the alternative, that something deeper was wrong, felt unbearable. I started doubting myself instead. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I came off as arrogant without meaning to. Maybe stress had changed me. I replayed conversations in my head late at night, searching for mistakes. Lena would sit with me during those moments, nodding gravely, sometimes gently suggesting how I could phrase things better next time, how I could soften my tone, how I could be more careful with people's feelings. I thought she was helping me grow. I didn't realize she was teaching me to shrink. The real unraveling began the night Amir broke up with me. We were sitting in his car, rain streaking down the windshield, when he finally said he couldn't trust me anymore. I asked him what he meant, my voice shaking, and he hesitated before admitting he'd heard things about me, things that made him question my honesty. He wouldn't tell me who told him, he just said it was someone who cared about me. That detail stuck with me long after he drove away, leaving me alone in the parking lot, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. Lena came over that same night. She held me while I cried, whispered that Amir wasn't worth it, that men were intimidated by independent women. She stayed until I fell asleep on her shoulder. I remember thinking, even through my heartbreak, how lucky I was to have a friend like her. The irony of that thought makes my stomach turn now. Over the next few months, my life seemed to shrink. My responsibilities at work were reduced, projects I used to lead were handed to others, friends stopped inviting me out as often. When I did see them, conversations felt strained, polite, cautious. I asked Alina once if she thought I'd changed, if something about me was pushing people away. She looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You've been through a lot. Maybe you don't see how intense you can be sometimes." It felt like a diagnosis. It felt like confirmation of my worst fears. I started therapy, desperate to understand what I was doing wrong. I journaled, meditated, apologized to people for things I wasn't even sure I'd done. Lena praised me for working on myself. She said she admired my self-awareness. Every compliment from her felt like oxygen. Without realizing it, I was measuring my worth through her approval. The moment everything changed didn't come with shouting or confrontation. It came quietly, almost accidentally, on an ordinary afternoon. I had borrowed Lena's laptop to print something because mine had stopped working. She told me to go ahead, that there was nothing private on it. I believed her. As the printer warmed up, a notification popped up in the corner of the screen, an email preview with my name in the subject line. It wasn't from me. It wasn't to me, it was about me. I stared at the screen longer than I want to admit, my heart pounding so loudly I thought she might hear it from the other room. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to respect her privacy, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. Another part of me, the part that had been living in confusion and self-blame for months, felt a cold clarity settle in. My hands moved before I could stop them. I clicked. What I read in those first few lines didn't make sense at first. Words like concerned, unstable, and difficult jumped out at me. My name was there, spelled correctly, framed by sentences that painted a version of me I barely recognized. I scrolled, my vision blurring, and realized this wasn't one email. It was a thread, multiple messages sent to people I knew, people I worked with, people I loved. I didn't finish reading them that day. I couldn't. My chest felt tight, my hands numb. When Lena walked back into the room, smiling, asking if the printer worked, I nodded and forced a smile of my own. I left shortly after, telling her I wasn't feeling well. That was the truest thing I said all day. That night, alone in my apartment, the silence felt heavier than it ever had before. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a thought I had been unconsciously avoiding for months. The idea that the person comforting me was the same person causing my pain felt impossible, cruel, absurd, and yet it explained everything. I barely slept. My mind replayed every conversation, every warning, every subtle comment Lena had made about my life. Memories rearranged themselves, forming a picture I didn't want to see. By morning, my grief had hardened into something sharper, more focused. I knew my life had been quietly dismantled, piece by piece, by someone who knew exactly where to place the knife. And the most painful part wasn't the damage she caused. It was the realization that I had handed her the blade myself, trusting her to protect me, never imagining she was the one slowly bleeding me dry. I spent the next day moving through my routine like a ghost, answering emails, washing dishes, nodding at people without really seeing them. Inside, though, something had shifted. The confusion that had haunted me for months was finally taking shape, and even though the shape was ugly and painful, it was still clearer than the fog I'd been lost in. I kept seeing that email subject line in my mind, my name sitting there like evidence, like a quiet accusation. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, that there had to be an explanation, but deep down, I already knew explanations wouldn't erase what I'd seen. By evening, the need to understand fully became unbearable. I returned to Lena's apartment under the excuse of picking up a scarf I'd left behind. My hands were trembling as I rang the bell. She greeted me with her usual warmth, pulling me into a hug that felt unfamiliar now, almost invasive. As she chatted about her day, I listened differently, hearing not comfort but calculation in her voice. When she stepped into the kitchen to make tea, I felt my heart race. Her laptop was still on the desk. I hesitated for only a second before opening it again. This time, I didn't stop at one thread. I searched my name. What came up felt like a slow-motion collapse. Messages sent over months, sometimes years, all carefully worded, all painting me as unstable, overly emotional, difficult to work with, prone to exaggeration, manipulative without realizing it. She wrote as if she were concerned, as if she were reluctantly sharing these things for the good of others. To my manager, she suggested I might not be ready for leadership because I took things personally. To Amir, she hinted that I had a habit of twisting narratives when I felt insecure. To mutual friends, she framed my isolation as self-inflicted, the result of my intensity. What broke me wasn't just the lies, it was how well she knew me, how expertly she twisted my vulnerabilities into weapons. Every fear I had ever confessed to her was there, reshaped into a flaw. Every insecurity I'd whispered during late-night talks had been repurposed as a warning sign. She never outright attacked me. She didn't need to. She let others draw their own conclusions, guided gently by her concern. I don't know how long I sat there, scrolling, my chest aching, tears dripping silently onto the keyboard. When she returned with the tea, she stopped short, her eyes flicking to the screen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, electric. Then she sighed, setting the mugs down slowly, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. "You shouldn't have read that," she said quietly. Not an apology, not surprise, just a calm statement like a rule I'd broken. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something inside me fracture. "Why?" My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Why would you do this to me?" She sat down across from me, folding her hands neatly. For a second, her mask slipped, revealing something colder, harder. Then it was back in place. She told me she was protecting me. She said people misunderstood me, that she was just helping them handle me better. She said if she hadn't intervened, things could have gone much worse for me. Listening to her speak felt surreal, like watching someone justify a crime they didn't believe was wrong. I asked her if she realized what she'd done to my life. She tilted her head, considering the question, then said, "You're stronger than you think. You'll bounce back." The casual cruelty of that sentence took my breath away. It was then that I understood something vital. She didn't see me as a friend. She saw me as a project, or worse, as a threat she needed to control. Anger surged through me, hot and unfamiliar. For months I had turned that anger inward, convinced I was the problem. Now it finally had a place to go. I told her she had no right to speak for me, to decide how others saw me. I told her she had destroyed my trust, my relationships, my sense of self. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. Every word felt like reclaiming a piece of myself she had taken. She listened without interrupting, her expression calm, almost bored. When she finished, she shrugged and said, "You're being dramatic." That was the moment something in me quieted. I realized she would never understand, never feel remorse, never give me the closure I wanted. Waiting for her to validate my pain would only keep me trapped. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and told her I was done. Done with the friendship, done with the explanations, done with the version of myself she had helped create. She didn't try to stop me. She just watched as I gathered my things and walked out, as if she was already writing a story about my overreaction to tell someone else later. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Cutting her out didn't magically fix the damage. If anything, it made me feel more alone at first. I questioned myself constantly. Was I overreacting? Had I misunderstood her intentions? Years of gaslighting had trained me to doubt my own perceptions. But each time I felt myself slipping back into that doubt, I returned to the evidence, to the words she had written about me when she thought I'd never see them. They anchored me in reality. I decided I couldn't let the story she had told be the final version of me. Slowly, carefully, I began reaching out to people, not to accuse, not to demand they choose sides, but to speak for myself for the first time in a long while. I met my manager for coffee and explained what had been happening, showing him the emails with my name in them. He looked genuinely shocked, then uncomfortable, then apologetic. He admitted he had relied too heavily on secondhand impressions instead of his own experiences with me. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it cracked open a door I thought was permanently closed. I spoke to Amir, too. That conversation was painful in a different way. He listened quietly as I explained, his face tightening with regret. He admitted he should have talked to me instead of believing someone else's version of me. We didn't get back together. Too much had been broken. But I left that conversation feeling lighter, no longer carrying the weight of unanswered questions. As weeks turned to months, I noticed subtle changes. People began treating me differently, warmer, more open. Opportunities slowly reappeared. But the biggest change wasn't external. It was inside me. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped shrinking my personality to make others comfortable. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of immediately assuming it was my fault. There were nights I mourned the friendship I thought I had. I missed the version of Lena I had loved, the laughter, the shared history. Grief doesn't vanish just because the truth comes out. Sometimes it deepens. But alongside that grief grew something steadier, self-trust. I began to believe my own experiences again, to honor my instincts, even when they told me something I didn't want to hear. Betrayal, I learned, isn't just about what someone does to you, it's about what it teaches you to do to yourself. For a long time, I had betrayed myself by ignoring my discomfort, by silencing my intuition, by choosing peace over truth. Walking away from Lena wasn't just ending a friendship, it was ending a pattern. I didn't get a dramatic apology or a public clearing of my name. What I got was quieter and more powerful. I got my voice back. I got the chance to rebuild my life on honesty instead of fear. And slowly, day by day, I began to recognize myself again. Not the version she described, but the woman I had always been, waiting patiently to be believed. In the weeks after I cut Lena out of my life, I expected to feel relief. People always talk about toxic friendships like they're chains you break free from, like once you walk away, you're instantly lighter. The truth was much messier. I woke up every morning with a knot in my stomach, half expecting my phone to light up with her name, half hoping it would. Even knowing what she had done, a part of me still reached for the comfort she used to represent. Habit can feel a lot like love when you don't know the difference yet. I had to learn how to live without the person who had been my sounding board for everything. I'd pick up my phone to text her something small, a funny sign I'd seen, a frustration at work, only to remember again and again that she was no longer safe. Each realization felt like a fresh loss. I grieved not only the friendship, but the years I had spent trusting someone who was quietly dismantling my life. That grief came in waves, unpredictable and exhausting. Some days I felt strong and certain. Other days I questioned everything. What surprised me most was how deeply her voice had embedded itself in my thoughts. When something went wrong, I still heard her tone in my head, suggesting how I might have handled it better, softer, differently. I realized then how thoroughly she had trained me to second-guess myself. Even in her absence, she had influence. Recognizing that was terrifying, but it was also the first step in taking my mind back. Therapy took on a different shape after that. Instead of trying to fix myself, I began unpacking what had been done to me. My therapist helped me name it for what it was: emotional manipulation, prolonged and deliberate. Saying those words out loud felt heavy, but also validating. For the first time, someone wasn't asking me how I could improve to make things work. They were asking me why I had tolerated so much for so long. That question sent me back through my history, not just with Lena, but with everyone. I saw patterns I had noticed before: how often I took responsibility for other people's feelings, how quickly I apologized, how deeply uncomfortable I was with conflict. Lena hadn't created those traits in me, she had exploited them. Understanding that didn't erase my pain, but it gave it context. It meant I wasn't weak. I had been vulnerable in a world that doesn't always treat vulnerability kindly. At work, rebuilding my reputation felt like walking uphill through mud. Even with the truth partially exposed, some impressions lingered. People are slow to unlearn what they've already accepted as fact. I focused on what I could control: my work, my boundaries, my voice. I stopped over-explaining. I documented conversations. I spoke up when something didn't feel right instead of swallowing my discomfort. Each small act of self-advocacy felt unnatural at first, like wearing new shoes that hadn't broken in yet, but slowly they began to fit. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the old narrative resurfacing: a comment about my tone, a suggestion that I might be too sensitive. Each time, my body reacted before my mind did, heart racing, palms sweating. Trauma has a way of living in the nervous system, but instead of collapsing inward, I practiced staying present. I asked questions, I clarified, I refused to accept vague criticism without substance. To my surprise, most of the time, people backed down. I realized how much power I had given away simply by assuming others were right about me. Outside of work, my social circle changed. Some friends drifted away quietly, and I let them go. Others stepped closer, admitting they had sensed something was off but hadn't known how to approach it. Those conversations were awkward and healing at the same time. I told my story carefully, without venom, without embellishment. I didn't need to convince anyone. I just needed to be honest. The people who mattered believed me. One afternoon, months after everything had come to light, I ran into Lena unexpectedly at a grocery store. I saw her before she saw me, my body tensing instinctively. For a moment, I considered turning around, avoiding the confrontation, but then she looked up and our eyes met. Time seemed to slow. She smiled, small and measured, as if we were distant acquaintances. She asked how I was doing, her voice light. In the past, that question would have opened the door to explanations, justifications, updates. This time, I simply said I was well. I didn't ask about her life. I didn't offer details about mine. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but when I walked away, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the release of something long held. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't shrunk. I hadn't given her anything to use against me. That encounter stayed with me for days. It marked a turning point I hadn't expected. I realized then that closure doesn't always come from dramatic confrontations or heartfelt apologies. Sometimes it comes from realizing someone no longer has access to you. Sometimes it's as simple as indifference replacing longing. I began to notice how my inner world was changing. My thoughts grew quieter, less critical. I laughed more easily. I slept better. Trusting others was still hard, but I was learning to trust myself again, and that made all the difference. I paid attention to how people made me feel instead of how I wanted them to feel about me. If something felt off, I didn't immediately dismiss it. I gave my intuition space to speak. The moral clarity of what had happened also began to settle. Lena's betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of her need for control, her insecurity, her inability to tolerate someone else's growth. For a long time, I had confused proximity with loyalty. I had believed that time invested equaled safety. Now I understood that true friendship doesn't require you to diminish yourself to keep the peace. There were still moments of anger, I won't pretend otherwise. Sometimes I imagined what I would say if I could fully express the hurt she caused, but those fantasies grew less intense over time, replaced by a quiet determination to live well, not out of spite, but out of respect for myself. I started setting boundaries with a firmness that surprised even me. When someone crossed a line, I addressed it. When something didn't feel right, I named it. Each small act of self-advocacy felt unnatural at first, like wearing new shoes that hadn't broken in yet, but slowly they began to fit. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the old narrative resurfacing, a comment about my tone, a suggestion that I might be too sensitive. Each time my body reacted before my mind did, heart racing, palms sweating. Trauma has a way of living in the nervous system, but instead of collapsing inward, I practiced staying present. I asked questions, I clarified, I refused to accept vague criticism without substance. To my surprise, most of the time people backed down. I realized how much power I had given away simply by assuming others were right about me. Outside of work, my social circle changed. Some friends drifted away quietly and I let them go. Others stepped closer, admitting they had sensed something was off but hadn't known how to approach it. Those conversations were awkward and healing at the same time. I told my story carefully, without venom, without embellishment. I didn't need to convince anyone. I just needed to be honest. The people who mattered believed me. One afternoon, months after everything had come to light, I ran into Lena unexpectedly at a grocery store. I saw her before she saw me, my body tensing instinctively. For a moment, I considered turning around, avoiding the confrontation. But then she looked up and our eyes met. Time seemed to slow. She smiled, small and measured, as if we were distant acquaintances. She asked how I was doing, her voice light. In the past, that question would have opened the door to explanations, justifications, updates. This time, I simply said I was well. I didn't ask about her life. I didn't offer details about mine. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but when I walked away, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the release of something long held. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't shrunk. I hadn't given her anything to use against me. That encounter stayed with me for days. It marked a turning point I hadn't expected. I realized then that closure doesn't always come from dramatic confrontations or heartfelt apologies. Sometimes it comes from realizing someone no longer has access to you. Sometimes it's as simple as indifference replacing longing. I began to notice how my inner world was changing. My thoughts grew quieter, less critical. I laughed more easily. I slept better. Trusting others was still hard, but I was learning to trust myself again, and that made all the difference. I paid attention to how people made me feel instead of how I wanted them to feel about me. If something felt off, I didn't immediately dismiss it. I gave my intuition space to speak. The moral clarity of what had happened also began to settle. Lena's betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of her need for control, her insecurity, her inability to tolerate someone else's growth. For a long time, I had confused proximity with loyalty. I had believed that time invested equaled safety. Now I understood that true friendship doesn't require you to. As time moved forward, the sharpness of the betrayal dulled, but its lessons stayed close. I began to see my life as something I was actively shaping again, rather than something constantly slipping through my fingers. For a long while, I had lived in reaction mode, adjusting myself around other people's expectations, anticipating criticism before it even arrived. Now, I was learning how to exist without that constant vigilance. It felt strange at first, like walking without a brace you'd worn for years. I noticed the shift most clearly in my decisions. I no longer asked myself what Lena would think or advise. Her voice, once so loud in my head, had faded to a faint echo. In its place was my own, tentative but growing stronger. When opportunities came up at work, I didn't automatically assume I wasn't ready. I assessed them honestly. When conflicts arose, I didn't rush to smooth them over at my own expense. I let things be uncomfortable if they needed to be. Discomfort, I was learning, wasn't danger. One particular project at work became a quiet proving ground for me. I was asked to lead a small team on a campaign that required both creativity and coordination. In the past, I would have deflected responsibility, afraid of confirming the narrative that I was too much. This time, I accepted without apology. I made decisions decisively. I listened, but I didn't defer unnecessarily. When someone disagreed with me, I didn't take it as a personal failure. I treated it as part of collaboration. The project succeeded, not in a flashy, dramatic way, but solidly, convincingly. The feedback I received was clear and specific. There were no vague concerns, no whispered doubts. That alone felt like vindication. Outside of work, I revisited my sense of community slowly. I was cautious, more observant than before. I paid attention to how people responded when I set small boundaries. Did they respect them or push back? Did they listen when I spoke or wait for their turn? These weren't tests I announced. They were quiet markers I used to gauge safety. Some connections didn't pass. Others surprised me with their steadiness. I also spent a lot of time alone, learning to enjoy my own company again. For years, I had filled silence with conversation, reassurance, explanation. Being alone had felt like abandonment. Now it became a refuge. I took long walks without headphones, letting my thoughts wander. I cooked meals just for myself, setting the table carefully even when no one else was there. These small acts of self-attention felt radical. They told me I was worth care even when no one was watching. There were moments when guilt crept in, uninvited. Guilt for cutting Lena off so completely. Guilt for not seeing the signs earlier. Guilt for speaking up and disrupting the version of peace we had maintained. When that guilt surfaced, I examined it closely. I asked myself who it was serving. The answer was always the same. It served the old pattern, the one that prioritized harmony over honesty. Recognizing that helped me let the guilt pass without obeying it. I began sharing my experience with others more openly, not as a confession, but as a story. I noticed how often people leaned in, their expressions softening with recognition. Some told me about friendships that had left them doubting themselves, about support that felt conditional, about love that came with invisible strings. I realized how common this kind of betrayal was, how rarely it was named. There was comfort in that shared understanding, a sense that none of us were as alone as we thought. One evening, a mutual acquaintance mentioned Lena casually, noting that she seemed to be having a hard time lately. The old me would have felt a surge of conflicting emotions, vindication, sadness, the urge to rescue. This time, I felt something simpler: distance. I didn't wish her harm, but I also didn't feel responsible for her well-being. That separation was new, and it felt like freedom. As my life stabilized, I revisited memories from our friendship with clearer eyes. I saw how often my successes had been subtly minimized, how praise was always paired with caution, how my independence had been framed as a flaw. These realizations stung, but they also affirmed that walking away had been necessary. Friendship should expand your world, not quietly shrink it. I also reflected on my own role in the dynamic, not to blame myself, but to learn. I understood now that my fear of being misunderstood had made me susceptible to someone who offered constant interpretation of who I was. I had outsourced my self-definition. Reclaiming it required patience and practice. It meant sitting with uncertainty and trusting that the right people would see me without extensive explanation. There was a moment, almost a year after everything fell apart, when I realized I hadn't thought about Lena in days. The realization startled me. She had once occupied so much mental space, so much emotional energy. Now she was simply part of my past. That didn't mean the pain was gone entirely. It meant it no longer defined me. I began setting intentions instead of expectations. I focused on how I wanted to feel rather than how I wanted others to perceive me. Calm, grounded, honest. Those intentions guided my choices more reliably than fear ever had. When new people entered my life, I let relationships unfold slowly. I no longer rushed intimacy. Trust, I had learned, is built through consistency, not confession alone. The moral of my story was becoming clearer with time. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the people who sit closest to you, who know your softest places. That reality is terrifying, but it's also empowering, because once you know it, you can choose differently. You can listen when something feels off. You can protect your inner world without apology. I didn't emerge from this experience unscathed, but I emerged awake. Awake to my worth, awake to my boundaries, awake to the quiet strength that comes from believing yourself even when it's inconvenient. And as my life continued to open up in new, unexpected ways, I carried that awareness with me, not as armor, but as wisdom. I had lost a best friend, but I had gained something far more enduring, a relationship with myself built on trust, clarity, and respect. With time, the story I told myself about what happened began to soften at the edges. It stopped being a wound I touched every day and became more like a scar. Still there, still sensitive sometimes, but no longer open. I didn't wake up thinking about Lena anymore. I woke up thinking about my own plans, my own needs, my own quiet hopes. That shift felt subtle, but it was profound. It meant my life was no longer organized around damage control. I started noticing how differently I moved through the world. I held my head a little higher. I paused before agreeing to things. I said no without layering it in apologies. These changes weren't dramatic, but they were consistent. And consistency has a way of rebuilding trust from the inside out. I was learning that self-respect wasn't loud or aggressive. It was calm. It was steady. It was the ability to stand still in who you are, even when others don't fully understand you. There were still moments when echoes of the past surfaced unexpectedly, a tone of voice that reminded me of Lena's gentle criticism, a comment framed as concern that felt a little too familiar. When that happened, my body reacted first, tightening, bracing. But now I knew how to listen to that reaction instead of dismissing it. I asked myself questions I had never asked before. Do I feel safe here? Do I feel seen or managed? Those questions became my compass. I met new people during that period, cautiously, intentionally. Some connections stayed light and casual, and I let them remain that way without forcing depth. Others unfolded more slowly, revealing a kind of mutual respect I hadn't realized I'd been missing before. These people didn't rush to define me. They didn't correct my feelings or interpret my intentions. They listened. And in their presence, I didn't feel the need to perform or explain. I could simply be. One friendship in particular stood out. We bonded over shared interests at first, books, long walks, a mutual love for quiet cafes. Over time, our conversations deepened naturally. When I shared parts of my past, including the betrayal, she didn't rush to give advice or analyze it. She just said, "That must have been incredibly disorienting." That sentence landed with more comfort than any reassurance I'd received before. It acknowledged my experience without trying to control it. Through that friendship, I learned how healing it can be to be believed without being dissected. I realized that what I had lost with Lena wasn't just trust in her, it was trust in my right to define my own reality. Reclaiming that right changed everything. At work, my efforts began to bear fruit in ways that felt quietly affirming. I was invited into conversations I hadn't been part of before. My opinions were sought out and respected. When disagreements arose, they were handled openly, without the undercurrent of suspicion that had once followed me. I no longer felt like I was constantly trying to disprove a version of myself that someone else had invented. One afternoon, my manager pulled me aside after a meeting and thanked me for my leadership. The comment was specific, grounded in observable actions. I smiled and thanked him, but what stayed with me wasn't the praise, it was the absence of doubt. I didn't wonder what he really meant. I didn't question whether there was a hidden critique lurking beneath the surface. I took the words at face value, and that felt like progress. Despite all this growth, forgiveness remained a complicated subject. People often asked if I had forgiven Lena, as if forgiveness were a box to check off on the path to healing. For a long time, I didn't know how to answer. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a single act. It's a process, and it doesn't always look the way others expect it to. I eventually realized that forgiveness for me meant releasing the hope that she would ever understand the harm she caused. It meant letting go of the version of justice that required her acknowledgement. That release wasn't something I announced or celebrated. It happened quietly, one day when I noticed my anger had softened into indifference. There were still lessons unfolding even then. I became more aware of how power operates in relationships, how influence can be subtle, how care can be used as leverage. I paid attention to who benefited when I doubted myself. That awareness didn't make me cynical, it made me discerning. I learned that discernment is not the same as suspicion, it's simply clarity paired with self-respect. I also learned how important it is to maintain multiple sources of support. For years, Lena had been my primary emotional outlet, my translator, my mirror. Losing her felt catastrophic because I had placed too much weight on a single relationship. Now I spread that weight across different areas of my life: friends, therapy, creative outlets, solitude. No single person held all the power anymore. As my confidence grew, so did my sense of responsibility to myself and to others. I became more careful with the stories people trusted me with. I understood how vulnerable it feels to place your inner world in someone else's hands. I made a conscious effort to honor that vulnerability, to never weaponize it, even unintentionally. Betrayal taught me how much words can shape reality. I chose to use mine with care. Sometimes late at night, I reflected on how close I had come to disappearing into someone else's narrative of me. That thought still sent a chill through me, but it also reminded me of my resilience. I had found my way back, not by fighting louder, but by listening more closely to myself. The story I carry now is not one of victimhood, but of awakening. I was betrayed by someone I loved deeply. That truth will always be part of my history, but it is not the end of my story. It is the chapter that taught me how to recognize real support, how to protect my inner life, and how to stand firmly in my own perspective, even when it stands alone. And as I move forward, building a life rooted in honesty rather than fear, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. The most important loyalty I will ever have is not to a friend, a partner, or a version of peace that costs me myself. It is to my own clarity. Once I claimed that, everything else began to fall into place. By the time the second year after the fallout began, My life looked stable on the surface, but inside, something deeper was still rearranging itself. Healing, I learned, doesn't move in a straight line. It spirals. Just when you think you've outgrown a pain, it reappears in a new form, asking to be understood at a deeper level. For me, that deeper level was trust, not just in myself, but in others. I realized that while I had rebuilt my confidence and reclaimed my voice, I was still holding people at arm's length. I was polite, kind, even warm, but there was a wall I didn't let anyone cross. Part of me believed that closeness was dangerous, that intimacy always came with a hidden cost. That belief kept me safe, but it also kept me lonely in a way I didn't want to admit. This became especially clear when I started dating again. The first few attempts felt awkward, mechanical. I found myself analyzing every word, every gesture, looking for signs of manipulation or control. When someone expressed concern, my body tensed. When someone offered advice, I bristled. I couldn't always tell whether I was protecting myself or projecting my past onto people who hadn't earned my distrust. That uncertainty frustrated me. I didn't want Lena's shadow to shape my future relationships. So I slowed down even more. I stopped forcing myself to be ready for anything. Instead, I focused on being honest, with myself first, then with others. When I felt triggered, I named it internally without judgment. This feels familiar. This reminds me of something old. That simple acknowledgement helped separate the present from the past. It reminded me that not every discomfort was a threat, but not every discomfort should be ignored either. Around this time, I had a conversation with my therapist that stayed with me. I told her I was afraid of trusting the wrong person again, of missing red flags the way I had before. She listened carefully and then asked me a question that shifted something inside me. What if the goal isn't to never be hurt again, but to trust that you'll recognize it sooner and respond differently? That idea settled into me slowly. I realized I wasn't the same person I had been back then. I was more aware, more grounded. I had evidence now, not just of betrayal, but of my ability to survive it, to learn from it, to walk away when necessary. Trusting others didn't mean abandoning myself anymore. This shift showed up in small, practical ways. I stopped oversharing early in relationships. I let people earn access to my inner world through consistent behavior rather than emotional intensity. I paid attention to how people reacted when I disagreed with them. Did they get defensive, dismissive, or curious? Those responses told me more than any grand gesture ever could. I also noticed how much more comfortable I had become with letting people misunderstand me. That used to terrify me. I had spent so much of my life trying to control others' perceptions, believing that being misread was a failure on my part. Now, I understood that misunderstanding is sometimes inevitable and survivable. The people who mattered would ask questions. The rest didn't need correcting. One day, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, a former colleague who had distanced herself during the worst period of my life. She apologized for believing rumors instead of coming to me directly. She said she saw now how unfairly I had been treated. Reading her words stirred a mix of emotions: validation, sadness, and a faint ache for the time that had been lost. I thanked her, genuinely, and then I let the conversation end there. I didn't need to reopen old doors to feel complete. Moments like that help me understand that closure doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means understanding what happened and choosing how much access someone has to you moving forward. I had spent years thinking closure came from conversations, from explanations, from mutual understanding. Now I knew it could also come from clarity and choice. As I grew more secure, I became more compassionate toward my past self. I stopped judging her for missing the signs, for trusting too deeply. She had loved sincerely. She had believed in the good in someone she called a friend. That wasn't foolishness. That was humanity. The shame I had carried around those choices began to loosen its grip. I also became more attuned to power dynamics, especially among women. I noticed how competition is sometimes disguised as concern, how envy can wear the mask of support. I didn't let that awareness harden me. Instead, it made me more intentional about the kind of friend I wanted to be. I celebrated others openly. I checked my own motives. I made sure my care never crossed into control. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I was breaking a cycle rather than continuing it. Betrayal can make you bitter, suspicious, closed. Healing gave me another option: discernment with empathy, strength without cruelty. One evening, while organizing old files on my computer, I came across journal entries from the period when everything was falling apart. Reading them felt like opening a time capsule. The confusion, the self-blame, the desperation to understand what I had done wrong, it was all there, raw and unfiltered. I felt a lump in my throat as I read my own words, written by someone who had no idea yet that the truth would eventually come out. I didn't feel embarrassed by those entries. I felt proud of the woman who wrote them. She had kept questioning. She had kept searching. She hadn't given up on herself even when everything pointed inward as the problem. That persistence saved me. I closed the file and sat quietly for a long time afterward. It struck me how easily my life could have taken a different turn if I had accepted Lena's narrative fully, if I had continued to believe I was fundamentally flawed. The realization made me fiercely protective of my inner voice. I promised myself I would never silence it again for the sake of comfort or approval. The lesson of my betrayal was no longer just about friendship. It was about authorship, about who gets to tell your story. For too long, I had let someone else write mine, edit it, distribute it without my consent. Taking that power back wasn't just an act of defiance, it was an act of self-respect. And as I moved further into this new chapter of my life, I understood something with absolute clarity. Losing my best friend was devastating, but losing my trust in myself would have been far worse. That trust, once reclaimed, became the foundation for everything that followed. As my trust in myself grew steadier, I began to notice something unexpected. My memories of Lena were changing, not disappearing, but losing their emotional charge. Scenes that once made my chest tighten now felt distant, like stories I had heard rather than lived. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly, in moments when I reacted differently than I used to, when I chose myself without hesitation, when I didn't need to consult an imaginary version of her before making a decision. I realized that for a long time, my healing had been about undoing harm. Now it was becoming about building something new. I wasn't just recovering, I was evolving. The woman I was becoming had clearer edges, firmer boundaries, and a gentler relationship with herself. She didn't rush to explain her choices. She didn't apologize for needing space. She trusted her pace, even when it didn't match anyone else's expectations. This became especially evident when a new opportunity arose that would have terrified the old me. I was offered a chance to transition into a more visible role at work, one that required presenting ideas publicly and leading discussions with senior leadership. In the past, I would have hesitated, imagining all the ways I could be misinterpreted or criticized. I would have heard Lena's voice warning me to be careful, to not draw too much attention. This time, I felt the fear and accepted anyway. Preparing for that role forced me to confront lingering insecurities head-on. Standing in front of others, speaking with authority, meant trusting that my words were enough. The first presentation left my hands shaking, but my voice steady. I focused on the content, on the work I had done, on the truth of my experience. When it ended, the response was thoughtful, engaged. No one questioned my intentions. No one labeled me difficult or unstable. The absence of those reactions felt almost surreal. Afterward, a colleague pulled me aside and said something simple. "You're very clear." That word stayed with me. Clear. It was the opposite of everything Lena had implied about me, and hearing it reflected back by someone who had no agenda felt like reclaiming a part of my identity that had been taken from me. Outside of work, my relationships continued to deepen in healthier ways. I learned to express needs early instead of storing resentment. I learned to listen without assuming responsibility for fixing everything. When conflict arose, I didn't see it as a threat to connection, but as an opportunity to understand each other better. Not every relationship survived that shift, and that was okay. The ones that did felt more honest, more spacious. One evening, I attended a small gathering where I didn't know many people. In the past, I would have gravitated toward the most familiar face, anxious to anchor myself. This time, I moved through conversations freely, curious rather than cautious. I noticed how differently I felt afterward, energized instead of drained. It struck me that I was no longer scanning for approval. I was simply present. That presence extended inward, too. I became more attuned to my emotions without being overwhelmed by them. When sadness surfaced, I let it be there without rushing to label it as weakness. When anger appeared, I examined what it was protecting. Emotions, I learned, are messengers, not enemies. Lena had taught me to fear my own feelings, to see them as evidence of instability. Unlearning that was one of the most liberating parts of my journey. There were moments when people asked about my past friendship with genuine curiosity. I shared what felt appropriate, without detail or bitterness. I noticed how little I needed to explain. The story no longer demanded justification. It simply was. I had been betrayed. I had walked away. I had grown. That was enough. Occasionally, I wondered if Lena ever reflected on what she had done, if she ever questioned her choices the way I had questioned mine. But those thoughts no longer held weight. They didn't change my life. What mattered was how I responded now, how I treated myself, how I showed up in the world. One quiet morning while journaling, I wrote something that surprised me. I thanked Lena, not for the betrayal itself, but for what it revealed. I thanked the experience for forcing me to confront patterns I might have otherwise ignored. That gratitude didn't excuse the harm. It acknowledged the growth that followed. Writing those words felt like closing a door gently instead of slamming it shut. I also began mentoring a younger colleague who reminded me of my earlier self, eager, thoughtful, uncertain of her own authority. I was careful not to position myself as an interpreter of her experience. Instead, I encouraged her to trust her perceptions, to ask questions, to speak up when something didn't sit right. Watching her confidence grow felt deeply meaningful. It was a quiet way of ensuring the cycle stopped with me. As the years passed, the story of my betrayal became less central and more foundational, like a lesson integrated rather than a wound reopened. It informed my choices without defining them. I no longer introduced myself through my pain. I introduced myself through my values. The most profound change, though, was how I related to myself in moments of uncertainty. When doubt arose, I didn't panic. I listened. I asked what information I needed. I trusted that clarity would come, as it always had. That trust was hard-earned, and I protected it fiercely. Looking back now, I see that the real betrayal wasn't just that my best friend worked against me in secret. It was that I had learned over time to distrust my own reality. Healing meant reclaiming that reality and honoring it even when it made others uncomfortable. I stand here now, not untouched by what happened, but undeniably shaped by it. I am more discerning, more grounded, more honest than I've ever been. I know the difference between support and control, between concern and manipulation, between love and proximity. By the time another year passed, I no longer measured my life by before and after Lena. That timeline had dissolved into something broader, something more expansive. My life wasn't a recovery project anymore. It was just my life, imperfect, ongoing, and finally my own. The quiet pride I felt about that surprised me. It wasn't loud happiness or dramatic triumph. It was a grounded sense of being rooted in myself. I noticed how differently I handled moments of uncertainty. When plans changed or people disappointed me, I didn't immediately assume I had done something wrong. That reflex had once ruled my inner world. Now I paused. I gathered information, I asked questions when needed, and let silence speak when it told me more. This shift alone changed the quality of my days. I had more mental space, less noise. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes I'd carried from apartment to apartment for years, I found photos from the early days of our friendship with Lena. We were younger in those pictures, faces bright with the kind of optimism that hasn't yet been tested. For a moment, sadness washed over me. Not longing, but recognition. We had both been different people then. I allowed myself to honor what had once been real without romanticizing what it had become. That balance felt important. It meant I wasn't rewriting history to protect myself or demonize her. I was seeing it clearly. Clarity, I realized, had become my anchor. Not certainty, not control, clarity. The ability to look at something honestly, even when it was uncomfortable. I had learned that clarity often arrives quietly, not in dramatic revelations, but in steady realizations that accumulate over time. In my relationships, that clarity translated into presence. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed patterns instead of isolated moments. I trusted consistency over charm. These habits weren't rigid rules. They were gentle guidelines that kept me aligned with myself. When someone showed up with care and respect, I met them there. When someone didn't, I stepped back, without explanation or guilt. There was a time when I believed walking away meant failure, that if I just tried harder, explained myself better, adjusted more, things would work out. Now I understood that walking away can be an act of wisdom. Not every relationship is meant to be repaired. Some are meant to be released so you can breathe again. This understanding extended beyond friendships. It touched every area of my life, work, family, even the way I spoke to myself. I stopped forcing outcomes. I let things unfold. That didn't mean I became passive. It meant I became intentional. I acted from choice instead of fear. One evening, during a long conversation with a close friend, she asked me how I knew when to trust someone now. The question made me pause. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her I no longer trusted based on words or intensity. I trusted based on how I felt after interactions. Did I feel clearer or more confused? Energized or diminished? Seen or subtly corrected? Those answers rarely lied. As I spoke, I realized how far I'd come. There was a time when I couldn't answer that question at all. I had been so disconnected from my internal signals that I relied entirely on external validation. Now, my inner responses guided me more reliably than any advice ever could. I also became more patient with others' journeys. When people came to me confused about their own relationships, I didn't rush to label or diagnose. I listened. I reflected back what I heard. I trusted them to arrive at their own clarity in their own time. I knew now that forcing insight before someone is ready can feel just as disempowering as manipulation. Occasionally, I heard fragments of Lena's life through distant channels, someone mentioning her name in passing, a brief update shared without context. These moments no longer stirred strong emotion. They felt neutral, like hearing about a stranger. That neutrality was a sign of how complete the separation had become. She no longer occupied emotional space in me. What did occupy that space was a growing sense of purpose, not a grand mission, but a quiet commitment to living honestly. I became more deliberate about how I spent my time and energy. I said yes to things that aligned with my values and no to things that didn't, even when those no's felt awkward, especially then. I also revisited dreams I had shelved during the years when I was shrinking myself. Creative ideas, professional goals, parts of me that had gone dormant because they felt too visible, too risky. I approached them gently, without pressure. I allowed myself to explore without needing immediate success. That freedom reignited a sense of curiosity I hadn't felt in a long time. There was a day when I realized I no longer needed my story to be understood by everyone. That need had once driven me to over-explain, to justify, to seek validation from people who had already decided who I was. Letting go of that need felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd been wearing in the wrong season. I didn't become immune to hurt. I became more resilient. I trusted that if something painful happened again, I would notice sooner, respond sooner, and protect myself without losing compassion. That trust was my true recovery. Looking back, the betrayal taught me that intimacy without integrity is not intimacy at all. That someone can be close to you and still not be for you. That love without respect quietly erodes the soul. These lessons were costly, but they were real, and they reshaped how I moved through the world. I no longer fear being alone. I fear losing myself. That shift has guided every meaningful decision I've made since. As I stand in this chapter of my life now, I feel something that once seemed impossible: peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on everything going right, but the steady kind that comes from knowing who you are and standing by her. I was betrayed by someone I trusted deeply. That truth will always exist, but it does not define my ending. My ending is still being written, and this time I am the only one holding the pen. As the years settled into something quieter and more predictable, I began to notice how the lessons from my betrayal were showing up in unexpected places. Not as fear, not as suspicion, but as discernment woven into my daily life. It wasn't something I consciously activated anymore. It had become part of how I moved through the world, like muscle memory built through repetition. I saw it in how I listened to people. I no longer filled silences to ease tension. I let them linger, watching what emerged when no one rushed to manage the moment. Silence has a way of revealing truths words often hide. Some people grew uncomfortable with it, rushing to reassure, explain, or perform. Others remained steady. Those differences mattered to me now. I also noticed it in how I responded to praise. In the past, compliments made me uneasy. I would deflect them, soften them, or search for the critique hidden underneath. Now I accepted them without suspicion. I let them land. That acceptance wasn't arrogance, it was trust. Trust that I could be seen clearly without being misrepresented. There was a time when my sense of safety depended heavily on how others perceived me. I needed to be understood, liked, approved of. Losing Lena forced me to confront how fragile that foundation had been. Safety built on others' interpretations can collapse at any moment. Safety built on self-trust is sturdier. That realization changed everything. One afternoon, during a casual conversation with a coworker, she mentioned that she admired how grounded I seemed. The word caught me off guard. Grounded. I smiled and thanked her, but inside I felt a quiet astonishment. If she had met me years earlier, she would have seen someone constantly scanning for reassurance, adjusting herself to fit invisible expectations. Now, without trying to project anything, I was being perceived as stable. That contrast felt like a private victory. I thought often about how easily my life could have gone another way. If I had continued doubting myself, if I had ignored the discomfort, if I had clung to a friendship that required my self-erasure. That alternate version of me felt distant now, but I honored her. She survived long enough to bring me here. Occasionally, people asked why I seemed more selective about who I let close. I didn't frame it as caution, I framed it as intention. I no longer collected relationships out of fear of being alone. I chose them based on alignment. That choice sometimes meant fewer connections, but the ones I kept felt real. They didn't require constant maintenance or emotional labor. They breathed easily. I also became more comfortable disappointing people. That might sound harsh, but it was freeing. I realized that disappointment is often the cost of having boundaries. If someone was disappointed because I didn't overextend, over-explain, or override my own needs, that disappointment was not mine to fix. Learning that didn't make me less kind, it made my kindness more honest. There were moments when old fears resurfaced briefly. A misunderstanding, a shift in someone's tone, a missed invitation. In the past, those moments would have sent me spiraling inward, searching for my fault. Now I paused. I checked the facts. I checked in with myself. Most of the time, the fear dissolved on its own. When it didn't, I addressed the issue directly. Clarity replaced anxiety. I began to see my past as not something that had weakened me, but as something that had sharpened my perception. I was no longer naive, but I wasn't hardened either. I could see complexity without losing compassion. I could acknowledge harm without letting it define my worldview. That balance felt like maturity earned through experience rather than age. One evening, while talking with someone I was slowly getting to know, the conversation turned toward trust. They spoke about their fear of being betrayed, their hesitation to let people see them fully. I listened quietly, recognizing the familiar tension in their words. When they finished, I didn't offer advice. I simply said, "Trust doesn't mean believing someone will never hurt you. It means believing you'll take care of yourself if they do." As soon as I said it, I realized how deeply I believed it. That belief had become my anchor. I didn't need guarantees. I didn't need certainty. I needed self-respect and awareness. Everything else could be navigated. Looking back, the most insidious part of Lena's betrayal wasn't the lies themselves. It was the way they made me question my own perceptions. Recovering from that took time, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. But once my trust in myself was restored, no external opinion held the same power over me again. I also recognized how important it was to speak about experiences like mine, not to dwell in pain, but to name it. Silence protects those who manipulate. Naming patterns gives others language for what they're experiencing. Whenever I shared my story and saw recognition in someone else's eyes, I felt that my pain had been transformed into something useful. There was a quiet confidence that settled into me as a result, not the kind that needs to announce itself, but the kind that knows when to walk away without explanation. I didn't need to be the villain in someone else's story to protect my peace. I just needed to be consistent with my values. As I moved further away from the version of myself who had been slowly undone by betrayal, I felt gratitude, not for what happened, but for who I became because I refused to stay lost. I had learned how to choose myself without becoming isolated, how to love without losing clarity, how to be open without being unguarded. My life now is not extraordinary in the way stories often promise. It is steady, it is honest, it is mine, and that, I've learned, is more than enough. The betrayal that once threatened to define me has become a reference point, not a destination, a reminder of what happens when I silence my intuition and how powerful it is when I listen. And as I look ahead, I do so without fear of unseen hands pulling strings behind me. I trust my awareness. I trust my boundaries. I trust myself to notice, to respond, to walk away if necessary. That trust is my freedom. As life continued to unfold, I became increasingly aware of how my inner world had stabilized. Not in a rigid way, not sealed off from emotion, but grounded. I could feel joy without bracing for loss. I could feel sadness without assuming it meant something was wrong with me. That emotional steadiness was something I had once envied in others, believing it was a personality trait I simply didn't possess. Now I understood it was a skill, one I had learned the hard way. I found myself reflecting on how betrayal reshapes time. In the beginning, it collapses your sense of past and future into a single painful present. Everything you thought you knew feels suspect. But with distance, time stretches back out again. The past becomes a place you can visit without getting trapped. The future opens up without fear dictating every step. I was living in that expanded space now. There were moments when I caught myself responding differently than I ever would have before. A colleague misunderstood something I said during a meeting and questioned my intent. The old version of me would have panicked, rushed to clarify, apologized excessively. Instead, I stayed calm. I clarified once, succinctly, and moved on. The issue resolved itself without drama. Walking back to my desk afterward, I felt a quiet pride, not because I had handled it perfectly, but because I had trusted myself to handle it at all. That trust extended into my private life as well. When new relationships formed, I let them develop at their own pace. I didn't rush intimacy to feel secure. I didn't reveal my entire inner world as proof of sincerity. I understood now that depth is built over time through consistency and mutual respect, not accelerated through vulnerability alone. That understanding protected me without closing me off. I also became more intentional about the stories I told myself in moments of uncertainty. Instead of assuming the worst, I practiced neutrality. I reminded myself that not every pause meant rejection, not every silence meant judgment. That mental discipline softened my days considerably. It gave me space to respond rather than react. One of the most meaningful changes was how I related to conflict. I no longer saw it as a sign that something was broken beyond repair. Conflict, when approached with honesty, became information. It showed me how someone handled discomfort, accountability, difference. Those moments told me far more about compatibility than endless harmony ever could. There was a time when I believed peace meant the absence of tension. Now I understood peace as the presence of truth. Sometimes truth is uncomfortable, sometimes it disrupts, but it doesn't quietly erode you the way false harmony does. That lesson alone reshaped how I chose to live. I thought less and less about Lena, not because I was suppressing anything, but because there was no longer anything unresolved inside me. I didn't need her to validate my experience. I didn't need her remorse. I had already given myself what she never could: belief. On a quiet evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I realized something that made me smile. I felt safe in my own mind. That had not always been true. There was a time when my thoughts were crowding with doubt, replaying conversations, searching for mistakes. Now my mind felt like a place I could rest. That sense of inner safety was the greatest gift to come out of everything I had endured. I also noticed how my boundaries had become less defensive and more natural. I didn't need to announce them or justify them. They existed in how I chose, how I responded, how I disengaged when necessary. People who respected them stayed. People who didn't faded away without confrontation. That simplicity felt like maturity. When I looked back at the woman I had been during the height of the betrayal, I felt tenderness instead of embarrassment. She had been doing her best with the information she had. She had loved deeply. She had believed in loyalty. Those qualities weren't weaknesses. They were strengths that had simply been placed in the wrong hands. I often think about how easily emotional sabotage can go unnoticed when it's wrapped in concern and familiarity. How dangerous it is to assume that closeness guarantees goodwill. But I no longer carry that awareness as fear. I carry it as wisdom. Wisdom doesn't shout, it quietly guides. The story of my betrayal has now become something I hold with perspective. It no longer asks for my attention every day. It doesn't dominate my identity. It simply informs my choices in subtle, protective ways. I know now that my life can be disrupted, but it cannot be quietly dismantled without my awareness again. There is power in that knowledge, quiet power, the kind that doesn't need revenge or validation, the kind that builds a life so grounded that sabotage has nowhere to land. As I move forward, I do so with clarity about what I will no longer tolerate and compassion for the person I was when I didn't know better. I trust my instincts. I respect my limits. I choose relationships that feel expansive rather than constricting. The betrayal that once felt like the end of my life turned out to be a beginning I couldn't have imagined at the time. Not because pain is necessary for growth, but because awareness is transformative when you allow it to be. I am no longer afraid of being misunderstood. I am no longer afraid of being alone. I am afraid only of abandoning myself again, and that is a fear I now know how to honor. This chapter of my life is written in steadiness rather than chaos, in self-respect rather than self-doubt. And as I stand here, looking at the life I've built from the ground up, I know with certainty that no one is quietly ruining my life anymore. I am present, I am aware, I am free. By the time I reached this point in my journey, I understood something profound. Healing isn't linear, and closure isn't a moment. It's a series of small, steady choices. Each decision to trust myself, each boundary I honored, each time I resisted the urge to justify or explain, became a brick in the foundation of my new life. That foundation was solid because it rested on clarity and self-respect rather than external validation. I had rebuilt my life in ways that felt intentional rather than reactive. I no longer let people's moods dictate my own, nor did I silently absorb manipulation masked as care. I had learned to notice early signs of control or subtle sabotage, and I no longer gave those tendencies the power to shape my reality. My awareness was not paranoid, it was protective, and there is a freedom in protection that does not rely on fear. One afternoon, I found myself reflecting on the friendships that had survived this period of upheaval. Some of them were quiet, understated relationships that required nothing but presence. Others were more active, more involved, but all of them operated with mutual respect. No one was speaking over me, reinterpreting my feelings, or framing my growth as a threat. That realization filled me with a gratitude I had never expected. I had a circle that nourished rather than depleted, and I could participate fully without the shadow of doubt lingering over every interaction. Work, too, had transformed into a source of pride rather than stress. I no longer questioned whether my achievements were legitimate or whether I had earned the recognition I received. I measured my success against my own standards, my own values, and my own sense of purpose. And the more I trusted myself, the easier it became to take on challenges without fear of judgment or sabotage. I had learned how to assert my voice without aggression, how to advocate for myself without guilt, and how to navigate conflict with clarity instead of panic. There were still moments when the old emotions surfaced, brief, fleeting sparks of anger or sadness when I remembered Lena or the ways in which she had manipulated situations, but those moments no longer controlled me. I observed them, acknowledged them, and let them pass. My life had grown larger than that pain, and my identity was no longer tied to her actions or her approval. I also noticed a profound shift in how I treated myself in everyday life. Small habits became acts of affirmation. I allowed myself to take breaks without guilt, to indulge in simple joys without explanation, to pursue ambitions with enthusiasm rather than hesitation. These weren't dramatic declarations, they were quiet, consistent choices that communicated one essential truth: I matter. My feelings matter. My well-being matters. And honoring that truth was an act of courage that far outweighed any fear of judgment. As time went on, I revisited my past with Lena not to dwell, but to learn. I reflected on the subtle ways she had undermined me, the tactics she used to manipulate trust and create doubt. Understanding those dynamics didn't make me bitter, it made me wise. It gave me a lens through which to evaluate relationships without cynicism. I could recognize red flags early, not because I feared betrayal, but because I respected myself enough to protect my peace. One pivotal realization came when I recognized how much of my own energy I had previously surrendered. For years, I had internalized responsibility for her reactions, her happiness, her perception of me. That energy, once reclaimed, became a resource for my own growth. I spent it nurturing relationships that mattered, developing skills I had neglected, and deepening my understanding of who I was apart from anyone else's narrative. That shift was subtle, but it transformed every corner of my life. I also began to write again, journal entries, reflections, letters to myself I never intended to send. Writing became a way to process, to observe, and to reclaim narrative control. In those pages, I could revisit old emotions safely, see patterns clearly, and celebrate the victories, both large and small, that I had accumulated along the way. The act of putting words to experience transformed pain into understanding, and understanding into empowerment. There was a day, months into this phase of reflection, when I caught myself smiling at a memory that once would have made me furious. I recalled a moment when Lena had subtly tried to sabotage a project I had worked on. Instead of feeling the old sting, I felt amusement, not because what she did was trivial, but because I had grown far beyond needing her validation or her approval for my own confidence. That mental distance felt liberating. It was the culmination of countless choices to step back, to observe, to prioritize myself, and to move forward without resentment controlling the narrative. I began sharing my story more openly, not as a cautionary tale, not as a source of pity, but as a testimony to resilience and clarity. People responded with recognition, with relief, with gratitude that someone else had navigated similar shadows. In those conversations, I realized that my experiences, painful as they had been, had utility beyond my own growth. My story became a tool, a mirror, a guidepost for others who might feel trapped in relationships that slowly erode confidence and self-trust. Through it all, the essential lesson crystallized. Betrayal does not define your worth, nor does it dictate your trajectory. What defines your trajectory is how you respond, how you protect yourself, how you honor your instincts, and how you reclaim the life you deserve. I had walked through fear, doubt, and grief, and emerged with a clarity I had never had before. That clarity wasn't loud or flashy. It was steady. It was deliberate. It was freedom. Looking back, I see now that my betrayal was a harsh but necessary teacher. It forced me to confront patterns I had ignored, to examine relationships I had taken for granted, and to redefine what loyalty, trust, and care truly mean. I learned that some people are never meant to walk with you to the end, and letting them go doesn't diminish your heart, it protects it. I also learned that self-trust is the ultimate safeguard. When I trust myself, I no longer need constant validation. When I trust my instincts, manipulation has no purchase. When I honor my boundaries, I create space for authentic connection rather than false closeness. That trust is the greatest gift betrayal can indirectly offer, if you are willing to claim it. And so, as I continue to move forward, I do so fully awake. I am aware of the risks that exist in relationships, but I am not afraid of them. I engage intentionally, love sincerely, and protect my inner life without hesitation. I have learned that true power doesn't lie in controlling others. It lies in mastering your own responses, safeguarding your boundaries, and living in alignment with your values. The journey has not been easy. It has required patience, reflection, courage, and countless small choices that added up over time. It has demanded that I confront uncomfortable truths about myself and about the people I once trusted implicitly. It has required me to distinguish between genuine concern and covert control, between love and manipulation, between loyalty and convenience. But the reward has been immeasurable. A life that feels authentically mine, a mind that is steady, a heart that is open yet protected. That is freedom. That is clarity. That is the life I fought for, and finally, the life I am living. And if I could leave one truth for anyone listening who has been betrayed by someone they trusted, it would be this: betrayal hurts, but it does not define you. Healing takes time, patience, and self-compassion. Trust your instincts, honor your boundaries, reclaim your story, and remember that the most loyal companion you will ever have is the one who has always been with you, yourself. No one can quietly ruin your life again unless you allow it. And now, I never will.